And we will begin with a short, well, actually not so short, a medium length introduction by myself of each of the panelists. And then they will present for about 10 minutes. And after that, we'll open it up pretty soon to the audience. So you're welcome already to post your hand in the question. Use the reaction button to raise your hand, and hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. So we begin today with Biao Xiang. Biao was educated in Beijing in the UK and moved in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic last year from his position as professor of social anthropology at Oxford University to become director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. So Biao, you've been a migrant in the midst of the pandemic. And there you are developing a research program on the anthropology of economic experimentation, frontiers of transformation, asking questions about the future of economic life, the role of digital technologies and platforms in the world economy. More broadly, and having begun with research on social transformations and inequalities in his country of origin, China, Biao his research has progressed, I think, in 3 big waves. Beginning with an ethnography of migrant Indian IT body shopping to Australian software firms. This 2007 book, Global Body Shopping, won the Anthony Leeds Prize in Urban Anthropology of the American Anthropological Association. His subsequent work, which also included some co-editing with Brenda Yeoh, directed attention to the role of private recruitment agencies and migration infrastructures, and his 2012 article, Predatory Princes and Princely Peddlers, the allusion to Clifford Geertz is intended, won the Best Paper Prize in the journal Pacific Affairs in that year. His work on migration infrastructures also considers conditions for the transnational social reproduction of migrants and the communities from which they orient. And that's perhaps a part that's particularly prevalent for our conversation today about the pandemic. I might also mention, Biao, that at your new center at the Max Planck Institute, you have a very interesting online research community called MoLab, which the participants might look up and participate in. I found it quite innovative. So we're very happy to have you, Biao, and please begin. You have to, of course.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so today I come here mainly to ask for help in developing an idea in relation to COVID and mobility. The idea is about what I call logistical power. During COVID, one thing that struck me is, number one, there are a couple of things that strike me. Number one is that many countries in the world were very proactive this time. Most governments, they impose lockdown or take different measures, despite of all the critiques that are doing too little, too slow. But I think by comparison, governments in the world have been very proactive. Of course, one of the common measures that adopted by governments are mobility restrictions. The outcomes, however, are very varied across the countries. East Asian countries are doing relatively well in terms of imposing lockdown and sustaining it. But then in comparison, countries in Latin America and in South Asia, particularly India, where I'm familiar with, lockdown was implemented in with lots of governmental effort. You know, as the Indian government last year, March 2020, it was meant to be very strict lockdown, but it was very counterproductive. A massive number of migrant workers rushed home, often on foot, because of the lack of public transport. So I'm thinking of one question. What would be the immobilizing capacities that a society need in order to stop mobility in emergency? What constitutes such a capability? And the two key observations in relation to this question. Number one, you can never stop mobility across the society. The only way to stop the most residents' mobility is to cultivate, to organize alternative ways of mobilities. If you look at China, the reason it was the Chinese government did successfully after February 2020, I mean, before that, of course, it was a disaster, was precisely government was very proactive in putting in place new forms of mobilities, such as, they dispatch medical doctors to certain places, they organize volunteers to drive car fleet, and they work with platform companies to develop delivery services, etc. This is number two. You need to pay special attention to links between different types of mobilities. Because shortly after February 2020, then you have the issue of migrant workers needed to move from home place in the countryside back to cities to work. And then you have multi-leg mobilities involved. You take a bus and a train, and then bus again from the station to dormitory and for workplace. And how you can link all this mobility together in order to securitize the mobility process, making the migration journey safe for migrants as well as safe for the public. So the linkage between multiple legs of mobility actually is a very important point for monitoring mobility. So these two things, you need to cultivate alternative for mobility, and then you need paying special attention to linkages between multiple legs of mobility as a way to securitize mobility, require a new type of power from government. And I call it logistical power, meaning that it is a power to have two meanings, this term. Number one is governmental capacities in facilitating and organizing, particularly reorganizing or reconfiguring mobilities, right? This government capacity of doing so. Number two is that actually in this process, new type of power, new type of control of government over society will be generated. So it will enhance the government's control over society. So that is as a result of the exercise of reorganizing mobility, you will acquire additional power. So that kind of basically is a power through coordinating and conditioning mobilities and circulations is what I call logistical power. So probably I will just stop here, and I want to hear your view, how we can develop this idea, and what would be the key aspect that we should pay attention to in order to break down this notion of logistical power? What kind of empirical evidence we should collect in order to compare different societies in terms of their, what I call the immobilizing capacities, the capacity of stopping mobility without causing too much damages. So both conceptually and empirically, how should we further develop this framework? I mean, this probably is something we, in the future, is important. The capacity of, you can press the pause button is probably an important sign of resilience. Karin, thanks a lot. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Biao. We have a first set of questions to discuss once we hear from all four speakers. Our second speaker today is Peng. She's a longstanding and well-known member of the SASE community. She is a professor of sociology and public policy and director of the Center for Social Policy at the University of Toronto. In 2021, she became one of the first Canada Research Chairs, part of the Canadian Government and Research Council efforts to highlight and promote excellent research and excellent researchers in Canadian academia. I think they made a very good choice. One of her early papers with Roger Goodman on East Asian welfare states has shaped the study of social policy institutions and world comparative perspectives for a long time. And she has since extended this research to comparisons within Southeast Asia and East Asia. And she has shifted from working on comparative to issues of global and transnational social policy. Throughout her work, she is engaged in an intersectional analysis of inequalities produced by social policies, often in response to demographic challenges for both women and for migrants. And most recently, she has been leading a very large collaborative research project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada on gender migration and the work of care, international comparisons. This looks at the reorganization of social reproduction on a global scale and how this is reshaping migration and impacting on family and gender relations and global governance. Her recent book with Sonia Michael is part of this, I believe. It's called Gender, Migration, and the Work of Care. She has been more recently working also on Canada and responding to issues of migrants and refugees in the pandemic in Canada as well. So she may well make that part of her contributions today.
Thank you.
We're eager to hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karin. I don't know, I feel a little bit embarrassed. I should say that that project, that large international project on the gender migration and work of care actually just finished last year. Well, this is what COVID does, get you finished. And we're now on to a new large partnership research project called the Care Economies in Context. So we're moving more toward the macroeconomic part of the care that also includes migration as well. I was just listening to Biao's talk and about logistical powers, and I really think this is so exciting. We must talk some more about this. So I was thinking to answer Karen's question, this overarching question about whether COVID and its impacts on migrant has actually opened new pathways to address some of the problems of the contemporary migration. I was thinking more about sort of that I should first sort of answer, think about sort of what are some of the contemporary migration problems, and then to see whether COVID impacts have actually opened new pathways to addressing them. So what I was thinking, what are some of the contemporary migration problems? I think there are a number of problems associated with migration and migration policies that have been already in existence well before the COVID that need to be rethought and that are highly problematic. But I just want to focus on two. And one is that I think migration and migration policies in many countries have been, and I think still is, largely driven by what I consider as the kind of old 20th century skill-biased mindset. The second problem, I think, is the lack of a broader societal understandings about the role that migration and migrants and immigrants play in supporting and sustaining our economies and societies. So let me just elaborate on the second problem first. I think in many countries, migrants and immigrants are really the key essential workers that support our economies. In Europe, as well as in North America, for example, a really large proportion of healthcare workers, ranging from doctors to nurses to personal care workers, are migrants or immigrant workers. And in addition to healthcare, migrants and immigrant workers also form the backbone of other key sectors such as agriculture, distribution, food processing, and domestic services. And in fact, it would be really hard for many countries' economies to function and sustain without the labor of migrant and immigrant workers. We really rely on their low-wage labor and as well their skilled labor. They are often really the shock absorbers, as we saw in this COVID pandemic. They are the shock absorbers of the national economies. But I don't think most people actually realize how much they depend on migrant and immigrant workers and how much these migrant and immigrant workers contribute to their economies. I think one of the most important impacts of the COVID has been a kind of worldwide recognition of the importance of care and other essential work. The fact that many of these work such as frontline elder care works or agricultural work is now called essential work in many countries suggests that people are finally beginning to recognize their importance. And throughout the year, as we saw people in the neighborhoods kind of banging their pots and pans and clapping hands to cheer the frontline care workers and calling them our heroes is one sign of that recognition. But while this suggests that people are really beginning to recognize and appreciate these essential workers, I actually don't think many people know or understand who exactly these workers are. In other words, I think people appreciate and recognize the importance of frontline essential workers, but I don't think most of people actually know that a large proportion of these workers are not just women, but also immigrants and migrant and often racialized women. So it's this disconnect between a kind of swelling public expression of appreciations for essential frontline workers on the one hand, and on the other, people's lack of clear understanding about who exactly those workers are. That, I think, is one of the biggest problems with the contemporary migration. It's because migrants are invisible, so people can't or don't see how migration and migrant workers actually fit in their economies. So now let me go back to the first program I mentioned about the 20th century skilled bias mindset. What I mean by this is that in many countries, highly desired migrants or immigrants are people with high skills. These are people with high levels of education and or with professional degrees, like people with PhDs and MDs and engineers, etc. So in countries like Canada, but also other places like Australia and the US, and increasingly also in other non-immigrant or non-migrant receiving countries like Japan and South Korea, the governments are adopting point system in their immigration policies to select these highly educated and so-called highly skilled people and providing them with permanent residency status or some forms of longer-term residency status, basically securing migration or immigration pathways for this group of people. So the corollary of this is that those people who do not fit in this category are then put in the so-called low-skilled category and are considered less desirable, regardless of how much labor market demand there are for these people, and regardless of the fact that many of these people are needed in the key essential sectors. Again, a good example of this is the care and domestic workers and agricultural workers. There is a huge growing demand in many countries for personal care workers, domestic workers, and agricultural workers. But despite these huge demand, they are considered low-skill occupation, and therefore immigration and migration policies treat them as contingent, non-essential migrant category. And this is reflected by their temporary foreign worker visa status, which gives them very little or no pathways to gain longer term or permanent residency and transition to citizenship. So in light of this, do I think COVID and its impact on migrants opening new pathways to address some of the problems? I think there might be some openings, but I'm not so sure how real or how lasting those openings are. For example, shortage of essential workers in key sectors such as agriculture and healthcare have forced many national and subnational governments in many high-income countries to make changes and concessions to immigrations and other policies in relation to migrant workers. For example, in Europe, some governments have extended work visas, made exceptions to travel bans, and were granted temporary status to migrants if they work or will work in the essential sectors. In Germany, I know that the government has just passed a minimum wage law for all the home-based care workers, raising their overall wage. And of course, many of these home-based care workers are migrant women from Eastern Europe. In Canada, because over 80% of the COVID-related deaths in the first 6 months of the pandemic last year had occurred in long-term care homes, we faced a really serious care worker shortage as a result. This then led the provincial governments to implement new policies, including, for example, province of Quebec to establish paid training programs for long-term care workers with assured employment plus a COVID emergency wage premium upon obtaining a certificate. And not only that, inviting domestic and international students, unemployed people, immigrants, and refugees and asylum seekers to take the training. Similarly, the federal government of Canada also changed its social security legislations, making temporary foreign workers and international students eligible for federal benefits, such as COVID emergency response benefit of $500 a week, and as well making temporary foreign workers eligible for employment insurance, the kind of benefit that they were never eligible for. So there appears to be some signs of policy change that seems to suggest that some openings for migrant workers, international students, and refugees to enter the receiving country's labor market that may not have been so open to them, and have their participation even recognized by the receiving country governments. But whether this is a temporary or long-term policy change, I think remains a really big question. Another big question for me is, to what extent has the COVID impact influenced the dominant immigration and migration policy thinking about skills and what kinds of immigrants a country need or want? On that point, I'm not sure if the increased recognition and appreciation for essential workers in key sectors have actually led to any noticeable changes to government policies prioritizing high-skilled workers over low-skilled workers, or even to rethink about what is high skill and what is low skill. So I think as long as the dominant mindset is focused on the recruiting traditional high-skilled workers and privileging them, then I can't see many new pathways to address the sort of contemporary migration problem. So I'll stop here and open to pass on to other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ito. We'll come back to discuss many of these issues shortly. We'll move on now with a presentation by Brenda Yeoh. Brenda is Raffles Professor in Social Sciences in the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore, one of the leading universities in the world, where she has also been strongly involved in university and research leadership. At the National University Singapore Asia Research Institute, she directs the Asian Migration Research Cluster. And I think it's fair to say that this institute and this cluster is a magnet for all persons studying migration in East and Southeast Asia region. Almost everybody passes through there at some point in their career. She is currently a high-level advisor for the International Organization of Migration and a number of other international and national organizations and research institutes in Europe, Asia, and the world. In these roles, she has also been advising on the impact of the pandemic on migration and proposing reforms for more social protection of migrants. Her extensive research and publications cover family migration, the impact of migration also on families, marriage migration, migration infrastructures, as I already noted, skilled migration, migrant aspirations and emotions in migration. And altogether, I think her research has moved the usual focus on labor mobilities to consider many other different kinds of mobilities. Her most recent work is a 2020 co-authored book on student mobilities and international education. And she also has an article this year in Global Networks with a co-author, Re-Theorizing Migration Theory. Among her recent current projects is a project on transnational relations, aging and care ethics. And a second one is on transnationalism and diaspora, both of which I suspect have turned attention to the impact of the pandemic. Brenda, we're very delighted to have you with us and to hear your comments today.
Thank you, Karin, for that very generous introduction, and for the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel that focuses on migration. That's, of course, an issue that many of us are very concerned about. So let me start by, in a sense, introducing the topic, which is, I think, has links to both what Biao has to say as well as what Yeoh has just talked about. Let me try to get the slides going. I'm not sure why it's not moving. So, yeah, okay. So, well, anyone who studies migration is aware of its potentially disruptive powers. For the vast majority who are capital poor, migration is an alluring but risky venture that's ridden with ruptures, insecurity, and uncertainty. So I've been working on how and why Southeast Asian men and women leave their families and homes and embark on overseas breadwinning migration journeys to become low-wage workers in wealthier economies. So something that really opened my eyes to the way that others organize family. So for them, life is already precariously lived, but the pandemic has made this even starker as pathogen risk and border closure stall transnational mobility. So to understand this increase in precarity, we need to take a hard look at the temporary migration regime that moves migrants across borders in Asia. So the focus of my talk today is on the temporary migration regime that Yeoh has also alluded to. Of course, it's not, it doesn't just prevail in Asia and elsewhere as well, but this is the dominant regime in Asia. So in the pre-COVID times, in an era of high mobility, temporary labor migration schemes have been increasingly predominant and prevalent globally. So pathways to permanency are narrowing, whilst temporary migration is growing almost twice as fast year on year compared to those with permanent visas. That's how quickly temporary migration has become the flavor of the world. So curtailment of transnational mobility during pandemic times raises questions regarding the sustainability of temporary migration schemes. These schemes are predicated on this unique combination of transnational mobility on one hand and enforced precarity on the other hand. In other words, it's a churning of migrants back and forth across the border following use and discard logics. So as mentioned in the COVID-19 aftermath, pathogen risks and border closures have stalled transnational mobility. This means that back and forth mobility has become difficult, costly, and risky, and this chisels away at the very rationale that underpins temporary migration as a supposed triple win solution for migrants and nation states. This has also severe implications for transnational families. The families have been, in a sense, researching for about a decade. Critical family life events have increasing power to overwhelm when life is lived precariously across hardened borders. For the migrant who is immobilized in the host nation state, and Biao talks about immobilizing capacity of states, and living in Singapore, I'm very well aware of the very stringent criteria by which mobility can be curtailed and people can be immobilized. So for these migrants who are immobilized in host nation states, it could be the illness of a left behind child or the dementia of an elderly parent. All these take on critical crisis dimensions as transnational mobility is stripped from the migration system. For other migrants who have lost their jobs and face repatriation, dependence on remittances to sustain a transnational family may also be undermined. And I heard a couple of weeks ago, the World Bank report that remittances actually didn't fall by as much as suspected, which does show how resilient transnational families are. But there was still an impact, I mean, in Southeast Asia in terms of the loss of jobs and the impact on families left behind. So for the other issue that we need to think about is racism. Because of course, whilst racism against migrants is certainly not new, the pandemic has unleashed what the UN Secretary General has described as a tsunami of hate and xenophobia across the globe. Temporary migrants are easy targets for vilification and blame. I think temporary migrants are really at the bottom of the heap where this is concerned, because this is exacerbated by the fact that temporary migrants have very little, if not negative, social capital to claim a place in whole society. Racism also hardens because their presence in the form of highly visible migrant enclaves and gathering grounds can no longer be quickly excised from whole society as their so-called temporary status suggests. So they are supposed to be temporary, supposed to, in a sense, give their labor and then disappear. But the COVID-19 and closed borders means that they are here to stay. So this has led to various kinds of underlying racism as seen in the case of Singapore. Sorry. Right, let me go on. So the pandemic, therefore, has compelled a rethinking of the sustainability of temporary migration schemes in the long shadow of COVID-19. And this part of the talk, I just wanted to reflect a little bit about what we can do differently now that we have the opportunity to do so. As Ito says, I mean, the pandemic has opened up many questions that deserve better answers. So whilst the precarity of temporary migration for migrant workers has long attracted scholarly attention and policy concerns, but with very few solutions, as we know, the pandemic has also laid bare the unsustainability of temporary migration regimes for nation states in a time of stalled mobility. So it's here is then an opportune moment to revisit a number of important but difficult questions that have not gained as much traction as they deserve in pre-COVID-19 times, because they all seem to be to do with migrant welfare, migrant rights, and so forth. But this time round, this kind of stalled mobility has meant that the impact on nation states is also quite severe, and therefore, in that sense, the stars are sort of in alignment for a time to do something about it. So I have like 3 sort of suggestions. I mean, they're not really suggestions, and I will certainly welcome discussion around these issues. The first is that in a post-COVID-19 context, where transnational mobility is costlier, riskier, is no longer cheap mobility and cheap labor that you can, in a sense, bring in from abroad. as you like. Temporary migration schemes that offer visas and contracts of longer duration, as well as selective pathways towards residency, would have greater viability than a use and discard model that's based on the back and forth churning of migrant workers. And we can discuss some of the innovations, so-called innovations that's happened in Asia and Europe, as Yeoh has talked about. And our question, of course, is whether these will be here to stay and whether there is a virtuous cycle or these are just temporary measures. So longer stays without the ambiguity of arbitrary contract termination would also obviate a recurring brokerage fees for the individual migrant, and this is very important in the context of Asia. And longer stays will also be more conducive to skills acquisition and improved labor productivity from the point of view of the nation state. So we need to think about what will persuade nation states to, in a sense, come up with a better deal for temporary migrant workers. So secondly, reducing temporariness also entails re-evaluating the place and value of migrant workers in receiving societies. Part of the battle is not just the government, it's also society itself. In Singapore, we see that segregating migrant workers in densely packed dormitories out of the citizenry's line of sight is the way that migrant workers are usually dealt with in temporary conditions. But this not only creates ideal conditions for virus spread, but foments stigmatization and social exclusion. So instead, social resilience would be enhanced by regarding migrant labor as an integral part of the national labor supply. So if anything else, to me, that's the most important thing, that migrant workers are not seen as workers that you bring in from outside, but they become part and parcel of national labor supply, and plans are made for them. So incorporating migrant workers into national safety nets that provide healthcare and income protection, as we saw during the pandemic, will not only have a positive effect on migrant welfare, but could be a means of future-proofing society and economy against the crippling effects of future pandemics. So in Singapore, with the outbreak of the contagion of COVID-19, the epicenter of the outbreak was actually the migrants' dormitories. And so in terms of contact tracing as well as vaccines, migrants were actually prioritized as a group to receive both the COVID testing as well as the vaccines. So this is something unheard of in pre-COVID times. Thirdly, the conditions of low transnational mobility in the long aftermath of the pandemic is likely to induce technological progress in sectors that are traditionally dependent on migrant labor. So, however, and this is a point for discussion, that technological innovation is very unlikely to completely automate away the need for migrant workers, particularly in sectors dominated by low-cost migrant workers, such as domestic work and construction work. We have seen in Singapore shortages of both domestic workers and construction workers because of border closure. And this has provided an opportunity for these workers to, in a sense, fight for better terms than ever before. So at the very least, technological solutions need to go hand in hand with reskilling migrant workers rather than be aimed at eliminating them, which would be futile, I think. So I haven't thought this through in great detail, but I would certainly welcome other suggestions as to how we could, in a sense, work on this opportune moment that the pandemic presents. So in conclusion, I just want to say that I think we need to work as scholars collaboratively on cross-national and cross-regional agendas. We have for a long time advocated multi-sited research, but my sense is that much of the work that we do is still very much circumscribed by national agendas or focused on either the receiving country or the sending country, and the pandemic basically doesn't respect those kinds of categorizations. So we need more sustained bifocal research that combines an understanding of the infrastructures of migration that Biao has written about, but also be attentive to migrant lives. So hopefully the pains of the pandemic, and I guess I'm being more optimistic than usual. Hopefully the pains of the pandemic that we experience, that's experienced by not just migrant workers, but also nation states, will help us to think about ways of doing things differently. Yeah, so thank you for listening. Stop share.
Thank you very much, Brenda. So we have also a movement through the pessimistic view of Peng, but which also ended with some ways out. And these Brenda has now outlined, and we'll come back to them shortly. But next, we'll ask Martin Ruse to give us some comments. Martin is currently on leave from his professorship at the University of Oxford. He is now chair in migration studies and deputy director of the Migration Policy Center at the University Institute in Florence. His research focuses on the economics and politics of international migration, with both a focus on Europe, especially the principle of free mobility in the European Union, but also with a strong international comparative dimension. His most recent book, and he has written many, is The Price of Rights: Regulating International Labor Migration. Martin's work is especially concerned with informing about the consequences of migration policy on attitudes towards and livelihoods of migrants, and to contributing to more and better migration policies. And in this, he's also worked in an advisory capacity in many organizations, including the UK Migration Advisory Committee, and he also co-authored the International Organization of Migration published World Migration Report in 2018. His current research addresses the tensions between free movement in the European Union and European welfare states, international cooperation on migration and refugee protection, the ethics of migration policy dilemmas, and relevant for us today, specifically on the role of migrants in shaping systemic resilience to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also with a view to similar shocks in the future. And in this light, I might also mention a recent discussion paper, which is available since, I think, September last year on the website of the Migration Policy Institute, which he did together with a number of co-authors, titled COVID-19 and Systemic Resilience, Rethinking the Impacts of Migrant Workers and Labor Migration Policies. Martin, we're very happy to have you with us today, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation, Karin. It's great to see everybody. Usually, you know, if one is the last speaker, you start by saying everything's been already said. But in this case, actually, I think I'm glad I'm speaking last, because I think what I'm going to say builds very well on actually all of the previous speakers' arguments. And what I want to do is talk about, or ask the question, whether and how the pandemic opens an opportunity to think differently about the effects of labor migration and about labor immigration policy making. And I'm primarily thinking about high-income country contexts, but not only. And I think it's important to highlight right at the beginning that, I mean, Brenda spoke and Yeoh actually spoke about temporary labor migration programs, but it's important to highlight that these temporary labor migration programs also predominate migration policy making in high-income countries. So the kind of permanent migration programs, the points-based systems, as Yeoh mentioned, are reserved for the most highly skilled migrants, and relative to the temporary migration programs, they tend to be quite small. So what I want to ask is, does the COVID pandemic have the potential to change the way we think about these policies, the way we design those policies, the way we think about the impact of migration? And well, I mean, the short answer is yes, in theory, in principle, and I think there are good reasons to the various ways in which this might happen. In practice, of course, it's a political question, and it's an important research question, kind of the politics of resilience strategies and what that means for migration policy. So I'll come to both those points. So my starting point really is, I'll go through that quite briefly, that as we know, that during the pandemic, the kind of resilience of the provision of essential services has become a key public and policy concern. So provision of health services, social care, provision of agricultural products, and so on. And we know that many of the so-called essential workers are migrant workers. So, I mean, that raises the obvious questions: how does migration contribute or impact systemic resilience? And so I define resilience just in a kind of OECD way as the ability to withstand, recover from, and adapt to an unexpected external shock. So I'm talking about systemic resilience, the resilience not of individuals, but of whole systems, for example, to keep providing health services, to keep providing social care and agricultural products. And so the argument basically that we are making, and this is based, as Karin mentioned, on a paper that Bridget Anderson, Friedrich Pöschl, and I have recently done, we're arguing that the way in which migrants affect systemic resilience should be taken into account when people assess the impacts of migration and when they design labor and migration policy. So that's a should sentence. Whether actually they are taken into account is a different question I'll come to at the end. So I think the starting point is, I mean, there is obviously a lot of existing work on how migrants contribute to filling labor shortages. And we know that the term skills is contested. There's no disagreement on what the shortage is. There's discussion about if there's a shortage, does that automatically imply a need for migrant workers? And we know from the kind of comparative political economy analysis that there can be important system and institutional effects. So why is it that the share of migrants varies across countries, even in these essential sectors? So we know that migrants are often overrepresented, but still the share varies. It's not the same. And we know that part of the reason is the kind of institutional and broader societal context. So other policies, labor market policies, welfare policies, housing policies, all these other types of policies create a particular kind of economy, create a particular type of labor market that creates a particular type of demand for migrant workers. So we know all that from existing research. Now we also know that kind of the role migrants can and should play in addressing these shortages is in a way a deeply political issue. Why? Because the answer to whether or not there's a need for migrant workers or whether there are any alternatives to immigration, such as raising wages, mechanizing, offshoring, depends on whose interests you have in mind. I mean, it partly depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, alternatives to immigration do not always exist, but sometimes it is possible to create a different kind of social care system, for example, that moves from low-cost labor to kind of slightly higher cost labor where perhaps more domestic workers are represented. So I think it is a political issue. And I suppose the question, the opportunity now is that existing policies and a lot of research is primarily concerned with two types of impacts, at least from the host country's point of view. The impact kind of on what could be called efficiency or kind of economic growth, and then obviously distribution, who gains, who loses. So most labor immigration policies are driven by some sort of consideration about how can we make migration benefit people and how can we protect those who might lose out in the short run. But the question now is, now what about resilience as a third potential goal, as a systemic resilience, as a third potential type of impact that we might want to think about when we talk about the impacts of labor migration and when we discuss policies. And now there is obviously a big literature on systemic resilience, which happens to be completely disconnected from migration studies, which I also didn't know until I began to kind of look into this. And I think that these really need to be brought together. And there's three types of insights, I think, or at least three characteristics of resilient systems that we can think about and take from that literature and then think what that means for migration. So the literature on resilience, systemic resilience, three key characteristics. I think resilient systems are systems that are flexible. So flexibility is highlighted. Networks and social capital, that the way the different parts relate to each other, and all of this is influenced by policies and institutions. So a system, so just crudely put, a system is hard to break, so it's resilient if it bends in a flexible way, and if the connection between its fibers are strong in terms of networks, and policies and management have an impact on that. So if you think about these things, flexibility, networks, and then how policies. What does that mean for how we need to think about the impacts of migration differently? So I'll mention 4 points and then conclude. So I think if you take if you take systemic resilience as a policy goal seriously, one thing we need to do, and this has been mentioned already in part, I think we need to shift the focus of the analysis from skill shortages or from shortages in particular occupations at the national level to systems at the transnational level. Because the question is not so much, do we need more workers to produce product X here? The question is broader, and is the system resilient enough to keep providing this product? And of course, the product can be provided in different ways, including through imports. So for example, the migrant workers play a huge role in the production of medical rubber gloves in Malaysia that are then exported to high-income countries. So suddenly, even if you think about it in a very kind of inward-looking way, in the way a lot of high-income countries perceive labor immigration policymakers, the resilience of rubber glove production in Malaysia becomes very important, and migrants might be employed in other countries. So I think that really makes the connection between what's happening in host countries, in high-income countries, and in lower-income countries and exporting countries. So I think that the focus should be on transnational systems. Now, as the second obvious point is, I think, a shift from short-term to long-term. I mean, this is quite obvious, but it's still important to mention it, that a lot of decision-making of employers tends to be kind of focused on shorter-term profits rather than longer-term resilience. I mean, planning for resilience means contingency, which means you need to invest in maybe extra resources that may or may not be used if you need them in the future. So that in the short run, that might create extra costs. And also political decision-making, of course, is focused on the short run very often. So the systemic resilience angle, I think, encourages us to think about these issues in a much more longer-term way. A third issue, and again, this is kind of theory, and we'll see how it works out in practice, but if you worry about systemic resilience, this policy goal of protecting domestic workers, in theory, should be reduced. Its importance should be reduced. I mean, a lot of our debates about immigration policy are about how is immigration impacting on us? How does immigration impact on domestic workers? How can they be protected? Well, but if the goal is resilience, the attention shifts much more to the provision of the output, the provision of the service. So it's not so much who is doing it, but how can we ensure that these services remain resilient? And of course, in this context, it's very important to ask how the socio-economic impact of, say, COVID on migrants themselves, how is that related to overall systemic resilience? If you think about flexibility, so one could argue, well, yes, we need more flexible, low-cost migrant workers because they're very flexible, more flexible than domestic workers, that's good for resilience. Well, it may not be good for resilience if then these flexible migrant workers end up in very precarious situations, and that might not be good for long-term resilience. So I think there's an important conversation to be had about individual resilience and systemic resilience. And the fourth point is, what all this leads to in a way is whether we need kind of a new politics of labor immigration. That sounds quite grand, but what that basically means is that if you take this seriously, I think we do need to begin to discuss some of these trade-offs and tensions much more explicitly than we've done so. So between short run and long run, between, what does skill mean? Low skill, many today's low skill, supposedly low skilled migrant workers are essential workers, are very important for resilience. So what does that mean, how we value them in society? So all the kind of debates that in a way migration scholars have been discussing for some time, saying we need to talk about this more, I do think there's an opportunity that this resilience, this policy concern with systemic resilience might bring some of these debates to the fore. And finally, so this is kind of what I think where the openings are. But I do think there's also an opening for research, because for any of this to happen, I think we do need evidence about some of these mechanisms and these types of impacts. And as I said, there's been very little research, I think, on how migrants shape this kind of systemic resilience. And I think there's also an important job for kind of comparative political economy and politics to look at how different countries, what kinds of resilience strategies they implement, and what's the role of migrant workers in them. Because just like we said before, institutions differences in institutions are likely to influence the use of migrant workers in particular sectors. Differences in political and socioeconomic institutions across countries are also likely to influence the resilience responses to COVID. So whether or not we have more migrant workers, whether we improve our working conditions, the extent to which we mechanize, the extent to which we outsource, the extent to which we engage in bilateral agreements with other countries. And again, what influences these types of decisions is kind of the workhorse of kind of standard analysis and political science as well. There's going to be material interests that going to influence these decisions. Some people are going to benefit from certain types of mechanization, for example. Institutions are going to matter, path dependencies, and ideas and public attitudes. And so, for example, it's a very important question to ask. This has been raised before. Is this apparent appreciation of migrant skills? Is that a lasting phenomenon? I mean, are public attitudes changing toward migrants? And I think there's a lot of research to be done on this issue. But I think I'll end here. But basically, what I'm saying is that I think there's a lot of different ways in which we can think about how the additional kind of objective of systemic resilience might have all kinds of implications of how we do research on the impacts of migration, how we design labor migration policies, but also an important job for research to look at the politics of it and to try to understand better the reasons why certain responses happen in particular institutional contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Now we can go to a broader discussion. And at this point, I would like to also invite the audience to start raising your hands so that we're sure to include you in this discussion as well. Now, the topics have raised some questions on their own, and also there are some cross-cutting themes that we might first address among the panelists. And of course, Biao has raised very specific questions about the capacities of governments to improve more secure ways of mobilizing populations or keeping them immobile when it needs to be done. But that is also flanked by other forms of mobilization. Both Yeoh and Brenda have talked about how the COVID crisis has made visible just how essential and important migrants are, but at the same time, it's exposed them to more racism and discrimination and stigmatization, and identified some of the ways in which, again, governments might create new policies towards migration or new supports for migration. And some of it moves clearly away from, first of all, assuming that these migrants are low skilled, and also from assuming that they're temporary, trying to make longer residences, for example. So in these states come up again. And this is a common theme, I think, in our conference at SASE this year, because states have been more active, but not actually have been acting in ways that are necessarily looking towards a different future after the COVID crisis. And then Martin raises the question also of how migration itself can influence what the state is doing through this concept of resilience. And we might discuss that as well as a framework for trying to make better policies and reforming institutions. So maybe we can just, since Biao asked a question, I won't start with him, but we'll come back to him. So hopefully he'll have some answers to respond to. But let me just go through the speakers again and allow you to react to some of these issues or to raise them in ways differently from how I have done. And hopefully by the end of that, we'll have some people in the audience who would like to also ask a question. So Yeoh, would you like to begin?
Well, I think what surprised me about all these presentations is that the remarkable coherence in what people are saying. I think we have all pointed out the similar kind of thing. One is about sort of the necessity, the importance of rethinking migration and the role of the migration and the role of the states in relation to the migration. And second thing that really struck me was how people were kind of saying, so as we sort of from our learning from the COVID pandemic, how we really need to also sort of shift the way we think about future research on the migration, making it much more collaborative and interdisciplinary, and really sort of looking at sort of the not only national specific, but the kind of much more global, transnational, and temporal sort of aspect of the migration. So these were a couple of things that sort of came, that struck me as I was listening to other people's presentations. I'm just going to stop here because I also see the hand up. Sandhya has, so I just thought it might be really good for other people to speak rather than just the presenters.
Would you like me then to take the question first from the audience? Okay, Sandhya, and feel free to introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, so I'm Sandhya. I'm a doctoral researcher in the Max Planck program at the University of Duisberg-Essen, actually under the supervision of Karin, Shire. I study recruitment industry in the context of Nepal. And just in quick response to the themes that very super exciting presentations, just quickly responding to that, my recent research on the impact of COVID in the recruitment industry also shows that forced immobility induced by the state on the migrants actually increased a lot of illegal activities in the market. So a lot of migrants had to choose informal channels, and in destination country, they were forced to go into informal jobs, risking their lives. And it seems that there's a causal link between forced immobility and an increase in risks and illegal activities. But I do have some questions to almost all the panelists here, and probably I can go one by one. Maybe I don't know what's the best way, but I can start with Professor Biao. So my question is, first of all, I really found the idea of logistical power super interesting. I was wondering, how do you plan to approach this concept, and how would it be different from infrastructural power, for instance? Because infrastructure also uses logistics to condition mobility, right? So I was wondering, how do you plan to differently approach it? So to you, the question would be that. And to Professor Peng, so you mentioned invisibility of migrants as a phenomenon, right? So pandemic also shows that migrants suddenly became also very, very visible during the pandemic, especially in the case of India. And suddenly everybody is talking about these migrants. Everybody knew that in cities, most of the workers are migrant workers, but suddenly middle-class families have begun speaking about migrants. They are giving donations and charity for these migrant workers, providing food for them on the way. So they've become suddenly visible. So I was wondering, how would you approach this new development? So Professor Yeoh, yeah, I also try to understand different, something else that I started looking at since the beginning of this year is to understand different kinds of temporary migration regimes. So I was wondering how you think Asian temporary migration regime is different from other temporary migration regimes in other contexts. For example, this can also include erstwhile guest worker programs and the new ones. So they are also temporary in character. And how would you approach this conceptually? How do you think it's different? Professor Ruse, I was wondering how you are approaching the resilience, systemic resilience as a concept. Do you also make this distinction between resilience of labor as opposed to resilience of capital? And I was wondering how you look into this differentiation, but I'll rest now. Thank you so much. It was such a great panel.
Yeah, I would suggest we give each of the speakers address and a chance to respond. So in order, I think it was Biao and Brenda and Martin. Yeah, okay, yeah.
But the Ito as well, yeah, after me.
Okay. Okay, we'll go Biao, Ito, Brenda, and Karin.
Thanks a lot. I mean, that's a that's a complex question. Probably I will need to think more. But basically, number one, logistic power needs quite a sophisticated infrastructural power to start with. It's very difficult to imagine that you will have a logistic power without infrastructural power. Number two, logistic power is more interventionist than infrastructural power. Infrastructural power, the typical example is tax system. We will have our tax deducted even before we receive the money. So everything is done automatically. But logistic power is not only, is not taking place automatically. It must be carried out very actively or proactively. An analogy would be infrastructural power is about building the roads, right? Once you build the roads, you enable people to circulate in certain way. So actually you have the control over the territory. You control the territory not by control people, which is a despotic power, but by creating, the road system and this electricity grid and etc. That will be infrastructure power. But for logistic power to be effective, it's not enough to build a road. You need to know all the identities of the cars, and almost you need real-time information about the traffic. And so therefore, you can send the signals, and of course you need the app and all the platform technologies in order to shape the flow, right? In order to shape a flow in real time. So that is then it leads to very serious questions, actually. Then you need a very developed surveillance system. You need a monitoring system in order for logistic power to be effective. And then it goes back to the judicial and political power, which Michael Mann think is kind of opposite to infrastructure power. So actually logistic power is a development of both infrastructural power as well as the more kind of traditional judicial power and political power. You need control of all the borders, ID, and you need legal enforcement. You need to use violence. Punishment become more important. Actually, discipline become less important if you wanted to stop mobility, for example. I mean, there's evidence for that. Yeah. So that is my my answers so far. Thank you.
Ito?
Thank you very much for your question. I totally get your question about visibility, invisibility, because I did say like the people don't really connect sort of who are these essential workers, that a lot of them are migrants because they're invisible. And then in Brenda's presentation, she talks about the clear visibility of these temporary foreign worker communities during the COVID. I think, so I mean, you hit the nail squarely on the head, because I think this is really about the kind of selective knowledge or selective understanding or selective sort of perspectives that we think about things. So it is possible. I mean, so in a way, yes, the migrant workers are both visible and terribly invisible, because on the one hand, we completely dismiss them in our consciousness, our understanding about who are actually supporting our economy, who are contributing to our society and our economy. On the one hand, on the other, when during the COVID and when these COVID cases rise in the, migrant workers' residences, we kind of go, whoa, these guys are really, so it's that kind of disconnect that I was talking about. And I think what it then points to is the importance something both Martin and Biao talks about making that connection, making that linkages much more so key to the way we think about things, the way we do research, and the way we perceive migration. So it means sort of connecting, making that linkages from sort of between the different sectors, different institutions and policies within our society and politics, and also making that linkages between individual experience and perspectives vis-a-vis migration, migrant workers, migration experience to a much larger systemic sort of thinking of that total sort of systemic contribution and importance of migration and migrant workers. So I'll stop here.
And
Brenda?
let me continue then. I mean, thank you for thinking of such interesting questions for each one of us. The question you asked me was to do with whether there are a difference in terms of the temporary migration schemes that are found in which prevail in Asia as compared to other kinds of schemes like in the Gulf or the guest worker schemes. My basic sort of understanding is that I think we are seeing varieties of temporary migration schemes, and the difference is in degree rather than kind. And in Asia, there are some distinctive features, I think. I can think of, for example, the fact that in Asia, commercial brokerage is very much part of the, you study recruitment, so you would know this, that the commercialization of migration, the migration industry is crucial in understanding temporary migration. And it's very much related to debt financing as well. Second issue would be, I would say that the schemes in Asia tend to be highly gendered. Women flow into domestic worker programs and men into construction work. So there's a strong gender angle. A third feature would be that it's tied to, I think, what Ito mentions as the hierarchy of skills, and it's differentiated according to skill levels, and the categories that you, in a sense, use to capture the migrant is very much related to what you think is the where this person is in terms of the hierarchy of skills. In Asia, I think spatial segregation is also a key feature. In many of the schemes, you would see dormitories as well as enclaves, which are not residential enclaves, but the kinds of commercial enclaves, weekend enclaves that pops up. And the last thing I wanted to say is that I think in many Asian states have strong legal and perhaps even logistical power to organize these kinds of temporary migration schemes, which to different degrees. So in a place of Singapore, I would say that the logistical power, legal power is extremely sort of pervasive. And we have very few of the illegal pathways, the clandestine work that you speak of. I'm not saying that there's no illegality within legal systems. So I'm saying that there's not an underground system of labor recruitment that exists alongside the legal. But in other countries, then there would be a difference. Yeah. So a thoughtful question. Yeah.
Martin?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not sure I have a very good answer, because I think we need to be, I think, much more clear what we mean about systemic resilience. And by we, I mean anybody who uses the concept. And obviously, when we say that it might be an objective, and what follows from that obviously really depends exactly how you define it. So as resilience is in part determined by the initial impact of the shock. So if a shock hits and then the system is reduced, how big is the reduction in performance? Then, of course, there's a second question of how long does it take to kind of go back to what it was? Does it ever go back to what it was before? How does it develop? So there's different ways in which we can define that. And I think there's different kind of ideas that people might have that follow from that about what a resilient system is. But I'm glad you mentioned resilience of labor, because I do think, so rather than migrant labor, because I mean, we're talking about migration here, but of course, when people clap for essential workers, they don't only clap for migrants, even though migrants are, but also for local workers who are also in many countries doing these jobs underpaid, underappreciated, undervalued. So I think it's, the question is to whether and how migrants are different from local workers, but also what are the different ways in which resilience can be achieved. And my point here is then there's not going to be one way, obviously. Again, the different, the way resilience is achieved in Japan or Singapore or Europe or somewhere else is going to be slightly different. It's going to be influenced by prevailing capacities and institutions. And in some countries, we might take a high-tech road. Kind of the capital is very important. Some people say machines don't get sick, so we need to mechanize and use fewer workers. And then in other areas, in other countries, things are going to be done differently. And I think this is quite important. I think that it's not saying that there's this one way, but if this is an additional consideration, obviously it's going to be influenced by some of those other things that already influence our choices. No, but thanks. That's a really good point. Thank you.
Not seeing other questions yet. Maybe people are formulating them. I may formulate a few comments and questions myself. I mean, I've been thinking also along the questions that Biao is raising about how much more power I want to give this state. One of the things that strikes me in Germany is that whether the state gets involved in trying to enable mobility or not really depends on for what sector of society it is and what kinds of people are being mobile. So we've seen the state actually make quite a few important changes in mobilizing migrants in food production, whether it's either picking asparagus and strawberries, or we've had huge changes in the meat industry that are all directed at improving the working conditions and enabling migrants to stay longer. There's a lot of contradictions in them, but there's been no response whatsoever to the estimated 300,000 to 500,000 women from Eastern Europe working in private homes 24/7 for care. It's as if it's not happening. Every now and then it comes up in the news. And I know some of my colleagues who are on the expert commissions have brought it into the parliamentary deliberations. But there has, in fact, what Yeoh was referring to is actually a court ruling brought by a Bulgarian worker. And, you can only pay the minimum wage if you're dependently employed. So, of course, what's going to happen is everybody's going to re-enter as self-employed contract workers. So these, even when, migrants themselves achieve an important capacity to improve their working conditions, but there's been no attention at all to their mobility, which is really shocking. So we see huge sectoral divisions between what we can get the state interested in and what we can't get it interested in. And in general, in care, it's very heterogeneous. And I think that Yeoh and Brenda, I can't remember which one now, kind of alluded to this. I think it was Brenda that, there are general policies now that have improved for the care sector. But they, those are where it doesn't matter if somebody, well, let's say there's migrants mixed with native workers. So they're not exactly problematizing the mobility aspect of care work. They're problematizing whether people have gloves and masks and access to the vaccination. But this is an interesting thing too for temporary migration, because as far as I know, no country in Europe doesn't, well, if you have a residency in the country that you've gone to, you can get a vaccination. But in many cases, migrants, don't even register their residency. They may be in subcontracting relations or informally in the domestic sector, and they don't have access to vaccinations. So if you can't prove that you have a residency somewhere officially. And a lot of posted work also hides residencies. Or cross-border work means that if you're coming from Poland into Germany on a daily basis, you also can't easily access vaccinations in Germany. So even there are ways in which the government just is perpetuating huge blind spots in how migration operates. And where we see it gaining more attention, it's where it's mixed with native work, or in specific industries that are now recognized as being important for national sustainability. But I see maybe it's also because of gender. In Germany, we still have strong ideologies of elderly people and very young children being cared for by parents. So nobody's worried about the fact when those migrant workers are made immobile, then the family has to come in and take care of it. And that's been a huge problem too. Just some comments maybe. I see Ito has raised her hand.
Yeah.
Anybody else would like to?
I just want to say that that's a really, really good sort of summary comment. And I think it sort of makes me think, it brings back to things that everybody have mentioned and sort of directly or indirectly. And that is the importance of really kind of the state, that the government need to have much more longer term perspective on migration and sustainability. So the use of the temporary migrant workforce is not just in Singapore and other Asian countries, but also in Canada. In Canada, we take in something like 300,000 people as immigrant class every year, and we're trying to increase that. And these are people with permanent residency visas, legitimate immigrants. But we take in over 550,000 temporary migrant workers every year, and they're working in agricultural, construction, the care sector, all sorts of sectors. They're basically 6 months contracts. They just have to go back at the end of the season, at the end of the contract. That kind of what Brenda calls the use and discard logic is really, really stupid, and it really shows the kind of short-termism, because it's like we don't have enough people working in this sector. Let's bring them in, and who cares what happens? Like, once that job is over, let's just get rid of them. We're not thinking about what are the longer term, what would be the longer term much contribution of these people for our society, for our economy. Wouldn't it be much more efficient in the long run and much more sustainable if we could simply extend that and incorporate them into our labor market, economy, and our society? Because I think that then would be the real win-win-win strategy. But we don't think about that because we're just thinking about short-term profit next month, next year, right now. And I think that's a problem. And that's why sort of our current migrant system is really unsustainable.
I think that's also what Martin was exactly arguing, that we need to see that migration is a normal part of our labor market, our value chains worldwide, and it shouldn't be something short and temporary and casually regulated. It should be more carefully supported by governments. And what Biao was saying in general, I think is very important to think about how states do have a responsibility for safe mobility. And one of the things that really impressed me about China, from the German perspective, I mean, in Germany, if you get COVID and you're tested positive, they send you home, and if your kids are there and if your husband's there and your grandparents are living there, you're all in danger. In China, they take you out of the home and put you in a container, or in Australia, they put you in a hotel. And I mean, this is what I mean about this underlying gender dimension too. It's assumed, that somebody's there to care for people, and that somebody is usually a daughter or a wife. And people were literally dying at home and infecting everybody around them. One of my friends called it the gender of R. Things were the pandemic was being perpetuated by our social welfare system that situates care at home. And in that respect, maybe it was better that the migrants weren't there because people stopped using the domestic workers. They stopped using the cross-border workers for 24/7 care. That would have been probably a bigger impact on migrant populations, at least from the German perspective. But I think we need, in fact, to think about safer mobility and, getting rid of this use and discard logic of migration. Any last words from our panelists?
Karin, could I ask Biao a question about logistical power? Because such an interesting concept. And I'm just wondering whether he could say a bit more about the territorial reach of logistical power. I mean, and the extent to which logistical power extends beyond territorial borders, and how do states organize in extraterritorial grounds? I mean, so because maybe I'm asking this because of course it's very strong within Singapore. I mean, every aspect of contact tracing. I mean, yes, like as Karin says, you will be straight away put into some kind of quarantine facility the moment you don't even have to test positive. You are sort of next to somebody who has that. There you go. But where it doesn't work is that Singapore basically is not able to perform its functions as a hub, which is what it lives on. And this closure of borders means that its transnational linkages are all broken. So I'm just asking the question as to how logistical power can be extended beyond nation state borders.
Karin, can I say something? Oh, yeah.
Yes, please, directly.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. And as if we go back to Ari time, I think I mean, it's a very tentative idea. I think that has a minor transnational dimension. If you look at how states deal with migration during the pandemic, there's a little shift, which is they move away from strict border control, protecting its border against the illegal migrants, move to two things. Number one is actually overseas repatriation or deportation, right? You either get rid of people like from Lebanon, the Ethiopia workers, and then Saudi, Kuwait sending back Bangladeshi workers, or repatriate your overseas citizens back home. And then actually they also did the third thing, which is you and especially Ito also mentioned, they try to stabilize migrant workers. So actually improve the condition, at least temporary, to stabilize. And some countries actually also import migrant workers. For example, Germany from Romania last spring for pick up asparagus, and then Canada from Mexico, right? In a form that this is our East Asian model, what I call point-to-point transplant, right? You just lift the workers from Romania back into the farm in Germany straight away without any stopover between. So here you have a little exercise of a logistical power. I mean, all these three modes of operation, you can see it's very nimble, dynamic, rather than just thinking of the territory per se. Mm. But however, the core to the idea of logistical power is territorially bounded. And here goes back to the idea Martin has proposed, which is very important, we think of systematically. Again, Ito and you also mentioned. But then there's two ways of thinking, systemically. Two ways of thinking systemically. One way is thinking migration as an issue that need systemic treatment, thinking. It's a part of, as Karin said, it's a transnational system is global labor supply issues. Second way of thinking migration systemically actually is thinking migrants, not as an exceptional group of population, but as a group of biological bodies which can get sick and in turn which can spread the virus. So in this sense, they are equal to citizens as biological bodies. I'm thinking actually what most nation states did during the pandemic is precisely the second way of systemic thinking. You mean the crisis is not new. You know, we have SARS 2003 and the financial crisis. I mean, we have financial crisis, Asia financial crisis in 1997. I mean, lots of construction workers were laid off, and in Thailand, especially, I mean, in Singapore too. And what did the government do at that time? They treat migrants as exceptional group of labor, lay them off, probably give some money and send them back. This time is different. You cannot treat the migrants as a separate social group because it's a pandemic. Biologically, medically, means you first of all have to treat them as equal biological body, carrying the same biological risk as others. So therefore, in this sense, in the biological sense, there is a leveling out. So this is what I mean. They are systemically thinking is that, okay, we treat the whole, all the people inside of my body as my target, as my subject of regulation and observation. So logistic power, in part, is to address this question. And so therefore they need a total surveillance. And this is quite clear in, I mean, of course, China is more about the internal migrants, issue of internal migration. You know, during SARS, migrants were singled out as someone, oh, you carry disease, etc. This time, no one talk about that. Why? Because everyone has to stay home. And so that is the idea of logistic power itself. But of course, in reality, as we all have noticed, in reality, when the logistic power is put in practice, it intersects with race, with class, with migrant status. You know, when the state needs someone to move around in a very dangerous situation, then no surprise, it happens to be migrants who will carry out this job, right? So, I mean, I can't really articulate very well, but I think it is interesting, but I think this may explain why we have a temporary improvement of migrants' working condition during the pandemic. Also why we see actually outpouring of humanitarian concerns for migrants. You know, migrants suddenly become visible. Why is that? Is that we'll become nicer? No. It is a side effect of logistical power. So I'm probably the most pessimistic presenter here. I think logistical power will become stronger, and then whether or not migrants will be more absorbed into the national economy, it's very much depends how we define it. We have to be aware the national economy itself is becoming less stable. Look at the gig economy. I mean, young college students are now becoming food delivery workers. Why do migrant workers get a better position than your own college graduates? Mm-hmm. So that the general economy is become more flexible, precarious. So in this sense, migrants are being integrated, but there is now citizens becoming more like migrants rather than migrants becoming more like citizens. So, I mean, so therefore there is a systemic change taking place. Yeah, thanks.
I understand much better. I do have to officially close the session, but we can stay longer. They won't close down this room, I think, until we want them to close it down. So let me officially end so that anybody who has to leave or needs to leave can do so without a guilty conscience. And then we just continue the conversation. Brenda, you wanted to reply, and Martin has raised his hand.
Is that, in that sense, I mean, what Biao reminded me is that logistical power actually strengthens national borders rather than rather than, in a sense, create sort of an alternative. I mean, I think in his earlier talk, he did talk about alternative forms of mobility that could be used to replace. But I think all that will be done within the auspices of the nation states. So in that sense, logistical power is not going to be emancipatory in any way. So
Martin?
that's all I wanted to say. So yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts that occurred to me as Biao was talking. I mean, if I understood correctly, yes, I mean, national borders might become stronger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're more closed, because I think the kinds of logistical power that Biao talks about might also be strengthened by greater global interconnections and by ability to, interact across borders. The other quick point I wanted to make was I think what Biao mentioned, the pandemic shows us that we are maybe more similar. So migrants and citizens are more similar in some ways. I think that's an example of, I think that kind of point is really important to bring about some of this change. I mean, to help ensure that these are not just temporary emergency measures, but there's more of a structural change. Because I mean, maybe this is my kind of pessimistic way of approaching it, but I think that the fundamental politics of labor immigration are such that it is done in purely consequentialist ways. I mean, there's very little concern about outsiders, there's about migrants. It's all about how does it benefit us. So I think if you want to bring about that change, I think there needs to be research, there needs to be knowledge that makes these linkages and shows, look, I mean, this is not just a thing we need to do for other people's benefits, but actually, we need to realize much more than the working conditions of Nepali migrants in rubber glove production in Malaysia should be important to us for also instrumental reasons, not only because we're concerned about work conditions of migrants abroad. So I think that kind of research is very important for linking the short term and the long term. And finally, if I can end with a short commercial, I should say that I've posted in the chat the link to our Migrants Hub. And of course, I apologize. I should have mentioned that Yeoh has written one of the contributions and a great paper on social care and systemic resilience. So I'm sorry, Yeoh, I feel a little bit silly for not mentioning that during my live talk, but there you go. If you're interested, please do check it out. Thanks.
Well, I just want to add on to what Martin said. That's a great link. There's so many amazing papers and reports in that website. So I constantly go in and check on that.
Okay, this was a great discussion. I'll see what I can do about editing a recording that will remind us of all the important points that are brought up. I think we have research agendas to work on, some with each other and some in other networks. And thank you all for participating. I enjoyed this very much. And stay safe. And hopefully we will all see each other at the next opportunity.
Thank you for organizing this, Karin.
Thank you, all of us. Yeah.
Nice to meet all of you.
Great to meet all of you. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.